Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Olly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk about the incredible longevity of Stephen King. So when I say longevity, I don't mean how long King has been alive. So King is 76 now, which is old, but it's not that old. What I mean is the incredible longevity of his career. So King's first novel, Carrie, came out in 1974, 50 years ago. He's just very recently, in the past couple of weeks, published a new book, You Like It Darker, which I have no doubt will be enormously successful as well. And pretty much in every one of those 50 years, he's published a book and it's done well. I was looking at the New York Times bestseller lists over the duration of his career, and in 34 of those 50 years, he's had a book that was top of the New York Times bestseller list for at least 1 week, which is amazing. It's incredible. I can't think of many writers at all whose careers have been as long and as consistently successful as Stephen King's. I was trying to think of Eddie. I think Agatha Christie is probably similar. I think she wrote for a long time, wrote a lot of books, and continued to be successful throughout her career. I think John le Carré had a long and very successful career. So started writing, I think, the late 60s and was continued to be successful up until the time of his death. But I don't think he wrote nearly as many books as Stephen King. Ed McBain, another one of my favourite writers, had a similarly long career. His career lasted over 50 years, and he was popular throughout it, but not nearly as popular as Stephen King, I think. So King has been, just phenomenally successful. To have hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list every year for 34 years is amazing. And when you look at the years when he didn't make it, there are, some kind of themes there that maybe explain it. So, for example, he didn't hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list for the first few years of his career. So the first book that did was The Dead Zone, which came out in 1979. So that hit that top spot in 79, but King's previous books didn't. And I was quite surprised by that. I would have thought maybe that The Shining or Salem's Lot, which were, really successful books, would have done, but for whatever reason they didn't. So those first 5 years you can take off. So therefore, in 34 out of the last 44 years, he's hit the top spot. So only 10 years when he didn't. Those 10 years then, I'll just go through them, were 1991, so his book that year was Needful Things. I'm kind of surprised that one didn't, because that feels like a time when he was successful, but it didn't. 1995 with Rose Madder. I feel like King was starting to be a bit less successful in kind of the 90s and early 2000s. And maybe that's just a personal thing, because that's when I kind of stopped reading him. I went through a period when I wasn't reading him nearly as much, and Rose Madder was kind of around the start of that period. I did read that one when it came out. I bought it in hardcover and read it, but there's definitely a few during that period that I didn't jump on straight away and read. So maybe other people were feeling the same thing as me. Next we have 1997's Wizard and Glass, so one of the Dark Tower books. And there is one other Dark Tower book in this list of books that didn't make that top spot. So I wonder if maybe, the Dark Tower books just generally didn't have quite the wide popular appeal of his other books because of being in a series. In 2000, we have the complete Green Mile. So the Green Mile had been published, in instalments before, and I suspect a lot of King fans read it in that way. I certainly did. So maybe that's why he didn't hit the top spot when that complete volume came out. In 2003, we have the other one of the Dark Tower books in this list, Wolves of the Calla. In 2005, we have The Colorado Kid. So this was a book King published with Hard Case Crime. So quite a different mystery book, in that it's a mystery book that doesn't have a solution. So I can kind of see why that one didn't make the top spot. I suspect that it didn't appeal to King's horror fans, and Hard Case Crime don't have quite the clout of King's regular horror publishers. In 2007, he didn't publish a book at all, so didn't make the top spot. In 2008, we have Dew McKee. So surprised that one didn't make it. A lot of people who've read it seem to really like it. It's one that I I haven't read. It's on the few books by King I still need to get to, and hoping to do that soon. But yeah, that one didn't. In 2010 then we had Blockade Billy, which again, like the Colorado Kid, is something a bit different. I think it was just a novella. It was the only book he published that year, and didn't make the top spot, so probably not a huge surprise. And then in 2020, If It Bleeds, which was a collection of novellas. So again, not a traditional novel. Maybe that's why it didn't make that top spot. But still, to have made, to have had a best-selling book for 34 out of the last 44 years is just incredible. And I was trying to think about, what is it about King that means he's managed to do that, and what's different what's different about his writing from other writers who were successful at the start of his career. So looking at those first few years, so 74 when Carrie was published through to 79 when he first had a best-selling book on that New York Times bestseller list. The other authors who kind of crop up on that list are in an interesting mix, and a lot of them are people who I very much associate with the 70s. So authors who were really, really big in the 70s, but the people don't read anymore. So we've got people like Gore Vidal. We have got John le Carré and Agatha Christie. They both had best-selling books in those years, in kind of the latter half of the 70s, and they are both authors who were that was kind of near the start of Carré's career, and he continued to be successful. Clearly, it was towards the end of Agatha Christie's career, but she had a long and very successful career. Other people then, so James Michener, writer of kind of great big historical epics. My dad's a big fan of James Michener, but he's definitely not someone who's widely read anymore. Arthur Haley, similarly a writer of, kind of big like beach reads. So things like Airport is I think his most famous book, the book that kind of spawned loads of airplane disaster movies. So his book, The Money Changers, made that top list in 75. We have Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. So Doctorow is, I think, a writer who is still respected and read today, but definitely not someone who has had anywhere near King's success or has written nearly as many books as King. We have in 76, we have Agatha Christie again, we have Gore Vidal again, we have Leon Uris. So Leon Uris is a writer I've never read, but who I think was very popular in the 70s. And then moving into 77, we have The Thornbirds by Colin McCulloch, so definitely a book I think of as a 70s book. We have The Silmarillion by Tolkien, so Tolkien, clearly an author who is still read today, but not nearly as prolific as King. And then moving into 78, we have Sidney Sheldon, so another very 70s author, so wrote loads of kind of suspense novels. We have Judith Krantz, who was big in kind of the 70s and 80s, writing, kind of big romantic books. We have Herman Wouk, so another writer I definitely associate with the 70s. So his book War and Remembrance, which was in his Winds of War series, made the top spot in late 1978 rather. And then in 79, just before King hit that top spot with The Dead Zone, we have some repeat offenders. So we have Arthur Haley again, we have James Michener again. Joseph Heller does crop up a few times in these lists, so an author who is still, read and respected today, but not an author you would necessarily consider to be popular today. And another one, another very 70s author who makes the lists a few times is Robert Ludlum, so a writer of kind of big spy novels. He was hugely successful in the 70s, probably best known today as being the person who created the character of Jason Bourne. So yeah, King has definitely outlasted, all of his contemporaries from those 1970s bestseller lists. And it's interesting to think about, why that is. I think part of it is just the fact that he is so prolific. So as I've said, in pretty much every one of the last 50 years, he's published a book. So that, that's got to help. But I suspect he's continued publishing because he's continued to be successful. I get the impression with King from reading interviews with him and things like that, he's someone who just loves writing, loves the experience of writing, and probably couldn't stop even if he wanted to. And maybe that's not true for some of these other writers, but the fact that his books have continued to be successful is, I think, fascinating. And I think there's something about his writing that just speaks to people and continues to speak to new generations. And I think that's the really important thing. When I think about people like Ludlum and Michener, those are people who my grandfather read. So, he read their books, but they haven't continued to appeal to new generations. Whereas King, I meet people in the comments and, chat on my Discord and things like that with people all the time who some who've been reading King for as long as I have. I started reading him in the 80s, and some who've only come to him recently. But he manages to speak to all of those readers. And I think it's interesting because his books do often feel like they are set in a particular time. He's a big fan of having cultural references in his books, so you can always place the time in which his books were written, and yet that doesn't bog them down. They have kind of a slightly timeless feel to them, and I think that's because of a lot of his themes are timeless themes. So he writes a lot about bullying, for example, which is something that a lot of people can relate to, and which continues to be something that people can relate to. He writes about the abuse of power a lot, and again, that is something that is a continuing theme throughout human existence. So, despite the fact that his books often feel very definitely set in a particular period, they continue to speak to readers because of those themes. And there aren't many horror writers. Well, there aren't any horror writers, I suspect, who are as successful as King. I think technically Dean Koontz has sold more books than King, and I think R.L. Stine has sold more books than King as well. But I don't think either of those writers would be considered to have had the same influence on popular culture as Stephen King has. They certainly haven't been as widely filmed as King has. And I think that's a really interesting difference between King and Koontz, is that there are hardly any movies based on Dean Koontz books. There are a few, but there aren't many. Whereas Stephen King, pretty much everything he's written at this point has been filmed, which is incredible. And those films vary widely in quality, but clearly there's something about his stories and his characters which filmmakers feel is worth investing time and money in. And I wonder if that, again, is part of the secret of his success, is that he writes and creates stories and characters which are translatable into other mediums in a way that seems to be consistently the case. We are still today getting new movies made of, and TV shows in particular, made of his books. So yeah, I can't quite fathom it, to be honest with you. And I say that as someone who really loves Stephen King's books. But for someone to be as successful and influential as King has is something I think that is really unusual and really special. So do let me know in the comments, why you think he has been as continuously successful as he had. Let me know, what he means to you as a writer. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.